In a vast and powerful Egypt, where laws ruled with an iron hand, a child was born in secret. His name would be Moses, and his destiny would change the history of an oppressed people under the decree of the Pharaoh. His mother placed him in a basket, letting him float in the Nile, hoping to save him. The Pharaoh's daughter found the child, and without knowing it, she embraced the future of the Hebrew people. 10 years later, Moses, now an adult, defied injustice. When he saw the brutality inflicted on his people, he decided to act, confronting the Egyptian empire and leading his people. Moses witnessed the Red Sea parting, allowing their liberation. The divine intervention not only freed the Hebrews, but also sealed the destiny of Egypt. Moses, the man who defied destiny, granted his people the freedom they had long yearned for. His name will live forever as a symbol of faith and courage, and his story will be remembered for all time. Moses.
At a time when Egypt stretched vast and imposing under the rule of strict laws and implacable decrees, the destiny of an entire people seemed sealed. It was the year 1526 BC, when the shadow of oppression was thickening over the Hebrews. It was in this scenario of fear and uncertainty that an event would occur to change forever the history of those prisoners of a mighty empire. Deep in a humble dwelling, where the warmth of home contrasted with the chill of tyranny, a baby was born. The crib was simple, and the cry that shattered the silence of the night announced the arrival of a life destined to carry both the burden and the hope of a people. His eyes, still blurred with sleep, lit up the dark room as if they already anticipated the light that one day would lead the captives to freedom. The name he would receive would echo through the generations: Moses. News of the birth spread discreetly among the Hebrew kin, living in constant fear of the royal decree. The decree announced that every newborn boy was to perish, a cold, calculated order to eliminate any future threat to Egyptian hegemony. Amid this bleak scenario, Jochebed, Moses' mother, knew that her son's fate could not be sealed by tyranny. With firm hands and eyes full of determination, she prepared for an act that required both courage and cunning. In the stillness of the night, Jochebed cradled the little one in her arms and gathered the materials to construct a special basket. Using braided branches and sturdy cloths, she fashioned a makeshift vessel light enough to float on the waters of the Nile. Every knot tied in the basket's weavings was made with the firm conviction that this work of love would save a life. Once finished, the basket seemed to carry not only a baby, but the promise of a new dawn for her people. With her heart pounding and her senses alert to imminent danger, the mother carried the basket to the bank of the legendary river. The water, in its slow and mysterious course, cradled the basket as if fate were dancing with the current. Jochebed gently released it with the precision of one who understands nature's caprices, and she watched as the basket drifted away, borne by the cold, dark current of the Nile. In that moment, silence reigned, broken only by the soft murmur of water and the stifled sobs of a mother releasing the most precious thing in her life. As the basket made its way along the river, the night itself seemed to conspire in secret to save the child. The waters, lit by a mantle of stars, shimmered as if charged with the mission of protecting the future that floated within them. Every ripple and every glimmer reflected the hope of a dream that, at that very moment, was slipping away from danger to enter the uncertain vastness of the river's current. At dawn, along the banks of the Nile, a young figure emerged among the morning silhouettes. The Pharaoh's daughter, known for her sensitivity and for silently questioning her father's ruthless laws, strolled through the palace gardens. Compassion shone in her eyes, a striking contrast to the severity that dominated the empire. It was then that her steps carried her to the riverbank, where the basket lay, softly delivered by the gentle current. With her gaze fixed and her heart agitated, the princess approached. The basket, now resting on fine sand, seemed as if it had been placed there by destiny itself. As she leaned in to examine this unusual object, the young woman noticed something that would transform her life. The serene gaze of a baby, wrapped in simple cloths and marked by features hinting at a courage born from hard adversity, fixed on her with an intensity that was both silent and inexplicable. Without hesitating, the princess opened her arms, and in a gesture full of tenderness and resolve, lifted the baby from the basket. In that moment, as her arms enveloped the delicate figure, time itself seemed to condense into an explosion of emotion. Aware of the significance of the encounter, the princess took the infant into the palace. From that moment on, the child's destiny became irrevocably linked to the greatness of Egypt, even though his origins were rooted in the hardships of an oppressed people. Within the imposing corridors of the palace, little Moses was cared for and protected. The royalty ensured him a future that starkly contrasted with the dismal past of his ancestors. Though he grew up amidst luxury and learning, the marks of that extraordinary beginning would never fade. He carried within him the quiet strength of an unprecedented survival, the grace of a determined mother, and the compassion of a princess who dared to defy the orders of power. The palace walls, decorated with hieroglyphs and imposing reliefs, bore witness day after day to the growth of a boy who, amidst such opulence, would never forget the lessons of humility and courage. As his tutors taught him the secrets of Egyptian language and culture, small details of his true origins would occasionally reveal themselves in whispers and discreet stories. Every gesture, every word, and every glance carried the heritage of a story marked by sacrifice and by the struggle for life. Even as a child, Moses displayed a curiosity and intelligence that drew the attention of those around him. Unbeknownst to anyone of the depth of his thoughts, he absorbed lessons from a world far beyond those illuminated halls and fragrant palace gardens. He was the link between two universes, that of a grand Egypt and of a suffering nation whose cries of distress echoed even in the shadows of the most forgotten corners. As the days turned into months and the months into years, the image of the basket drifting on the Nile lived on as a symbol of a mother's daring and determination. Every ripple in the water, every glint of light from the rising sun, silently recounted the memory of that decisive moment. The narrative of the escape, woven with courage and cunning, remained alive in the hearts of those who knew the secrets of redemption. At the Egyptian court, the destiny of the child grew in tandem with the empire's magnificence. There was no pause in the succession of days, and Moses's future unfolded amidst lessons, festivities, and rituals that taught him the customs of a people who, without realizing it, were preparing him for a legacy that would eventually transcend time. Every teaching, every experience, and every careful glance was like a brushstroke slowly sculpting the figure of one who would one day rise to free the oppressed. The events of that era became etched with the precision of a dream, realized amid adversity. Moses' cradle, which had witnessed the courage of a mother and the compassion of a princess, became the starting point of an unparalleled journey. In the heart of Egypt, where power and pain intermingled, the story of the child saved from the waters bore, in every detail, the essence of a journey that was only just beginning. In the blistering heat of Egypt, under the severe gaze of a sun that reveals all, Moses later walked along the wide stone avenues of the city, now an adult bearing upon his shoulders the restlessness that had taken root within him. On that fateful day, destiny was preparing a new chapter for the one who had once been sheltered in royal palaces. While passing through one of the bustling markets, echoes of anguished cries tore through the heavy, polluted air. His sharp, vigilant gaze fell upon a scene he would never forget. At the edge of a narrow alley, beneath the shadow of monumental columns that testified to the empire's power, an Egyptian officer wielded the authority granted to him by the Pharaoh without fear. With brusque gestures, the official lashed a ragged Hebrew, whose muffled cries mingled with the aggressive sound of the whip and the fearful murmurs of those watching. The contrast between the opulence of power and the misery of the oppressed was stark in that scene, and the indignation that welled inside Moses flared like a live flame. Driven by an almost irresistible impulse, he advanced through the gathered crowd and among those huddled in the shadows, determined to halt the injustice. Each of his steps resonated like a ceremonial beat, and the air seemed to vibrate with the tension of that dramatic moment. Without hesitation, Moses approached the aggressor, who, absorbed in his brutality, barely noticed the figure standing before him. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the impact of his actions resounded without the need for words. With a swift and resolute movement, Moses disarmed the Egyptian, whose gaze instantly transformed into a sea of surprise and fear, and, armed not only with physical strength, but also with the conviction to spare the defenseless, struck the man who was abusing his authority to oppress. The struggle was brief and intense. The blade of his resolve cut through the oppressive silence, and the official's body toppled, ending an act of violence that, although inevitable, sealed the fate of the man who had dared to infringe upon the dignity of a Hebrew. In Moses' eyes burned a flame, urging him to defend justice, even if the price was high. The tumult soon spread throughout the street. Uneasy murmurs and hurried footsteps announced the approach of a storm of reprisals. The sounds of running and the rustling of voices mingled with the fresh echo of the clash. Aware of the imminent risk and the fury that would undoubtedly descend upon him, Moses felt the full weight of inevitability. He knew that his action, though a cry against oppression, would not go unnoticed. Pharaoh's justice would be relentless. Without looking back, he fled through the narrow labyrinthine streets of Egypt, where every shadow seemed to hide murderous eyes, and every corner concealed traps set to hinder the steps of a man who dared challenge the system. The environment that had once been a stage for splendor and majesty was now transformed into a hostile setting, where freedom had a steep price and survival was a constant risk. Moses traversed the dusty paths with the urgency of one seeking shelter in the uncertainties that lay ahead. His bare feet trod the sand mingled with road dust and the scars of imperial pursuits. As daylight turned the arid landscape into a sea of golden light and shadows, he headed toward a destination that, though uncertain, promised refuge from the perils that Egypt imposed at that time. Thus his journey led him to the border of a territory where he would come to know another face of existence, the land of Midian. In this new land, the desert heat and the vast open horizons welcomed him with a mixture of mistrust and the promise of a fresh start. Crossing the boundaries where the dunes stretched like endless waves, Moses felt he was leaving behind not only the stone walls that had once imprisoned him, but also the screams and violence of that dreaded day. Yet the weight of his deed and the mark of his actions still pulsed within him, a reminder that every decision carried the echo of future consequences. Throughout the long journey of escape, nights passed beneath endless skies where the stars, in their silent dance, seemed to guide his steps. The wind that swept over the sands carried fragments of tattered tales, and every sigh of the desert recalled both moments past and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The environment was harsh, and solitude became a silent companion, but the determination burning in his heart propelled him forward, even in the face of threats lurking around every bend in the desert roads. Approaching the inhabited areas of Midian, Moses demonstrated caution and wisdom. In this land, fabled for offering help, hospitality, and new hope to those fleeing implacable fates, he soon arrived at a village. Here, faces both hesitantly wary of the stranger and yet reflective of a culture that esteemed survival and fraternity met him. Amid the tents and simple dwellings, Moses found shelter and began to sketch the first outlines of a new life, far removed from the tyranny that had forced him to confront fear at every turn. In this humble setting, the gentle voices of the locals contrasted with the shrill echoes of Egypt. Curious glances, laden with their own stories, regarded Moses with a mixture of mistrust and compassion that only those acquainted with pain can offer. Still marked by the glow of his recent act and the adrenaline of a desperate flight, he temporarily withdrew from the glare of divine justice and focused on his survival and the search for a new purpose in this foreign land. Those initial hours in Midian were lived with both caution and resolve. Moses understood that in this place, so unlike the Egyptian palace, there might be an opportunity to reconnect with his origins and perhaps finally find the redemption hidden within the recesses of his past. Every step was a reminder that exile, though painful, might also be the beginning of an enlightening journey toward renewed strength. At the close of that day, under a sky studded with stars, the fugitive settled into a modest nook where the silence of the night was broken only by the whisper of the wind that recounted ancient desert chronicles. Finally, free from the menacing presence of the Egyptian soldiers, Moses had, for the first time in a long while, the chance to breathe and plan his next moves. The incident, that moment of impetuous justice, had cast him away from the world he once knew, guiding him into a realm where challenges were of a different sort, and where hope might yet sprout anew. Thus, in this dramatic narrative full of twists and turns, the man who had been sheltered in royal cradles and who bore the heritage of his oppressed people revealed his courage and impulsiveness. The mark of that day, etched upon memory and destiny, sealed an unbreakable commitment to justice and to the desire to give the oppressed a chance to rise again. Among the hot sands and silent nights of Midian, Moses' journey took on a new course, one far from the empire that had forged him and the violence that had robbed him of the innocence to live unafraid. And so, with the same intensity that had driven him to confront tyranny on that fateful day, he advanced toward an uncertain future, one filled with the promise of rebirth and a legacy that one day would transform the history of his people forever. After traveling long roads beneath the scorching desert sun, Moses entered the land of Midian, with a body still marked by exhaustion and a mind keenly aware of the uncertainties ahead. His path led him to a vast oasis where majestic palm trees swayed and the murmur of water heralded the promise of sanctuary. Though his heart was still troubled by turbulent memories of Egypt, he sought the peace found among the dunes and within the serene expanses of this new land. Approaching a well surrounded by expansive fields where shepherds tended their flocks, Moses paused for a moment. His eyes, alert to every movement, observed a group of women who moved with gentle gestures as they arrived to quench the thirst of their animals. In that humble setting of hard work and simplicity, fate was quietly weaving its threads, preparing an encounter that would soon change his life. As he drew near, murmurs of astonishment and admiration crossed the faces of those present. The stranger exuded an aura of mystery and strength, evident in his upright bearing and determined expression. The women, long acquainted with the routine of the oasis, could not help but notice the profound gaze of the foreigner, a gaze that spoke of countless journeys and bore the unmistakable mark of one who had endured intense trials. Among them, a young woman with delicate features and bright eyes stood out. She was Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, the respected priest of the region. As the other women busied themselves filling jars with the refreshing water, Zipporah approached with steady, curious steps, as if she sensed something extraordinary in the new visitor. Moses, for his part, absorbed every detail: the way the sun gently caressed her face, the serenity that contrasted with the hardships of the paths he had trodden, and the blend of surprise and compassion that seemed to fill the air around them. The encounter unfolded naturally, yet with an intensity that hinted at irrevocable change. Amidst the simple sounds of clinking jars, rustling tents in the breeze, and low murmured conversations, Moses came to the aid of Zipporah and her sisters by intervening in a dispute between rival shepherds. His immediate, unhesitating gesture forged a silent pact of respect and admiration. In that moment, the regard that Zipporah held for the stranger blossomed into shy smiles and glances filled with gratitude. A few days later, Jethro, the wise and authoritative priest, learned of the presence of the man whose courageous and just actions had aided his family. Curious about the rumors spreading among the tents, Jethro invited Moses to rest and wash, offering him hospitality, nourishment, and shelter. In the modest comfort of a clay house roofed with thatch, the two men sat together and talked. With a deep, measured tone, Jethro inquired about Moses' origins and the reasons that had led him to traverse the desert paths. Moses, with sincerity and without hiding the traumas of his past, recounted his escape from Egypt, the violence he had endured, and the difficult choice that had driven him to abandon his ancestral land. Every word carried an almost palpable strength, as if his deeds and the dangers he had faced were distilled into an account that resonated in his host's heart. Touched by the tale and by Moses' honorable demeanor, the priest Jethro took him under his protection without judgment or prejudice, recognizing in him a noble and determined soul. Watching from a distance, Zipporah approached again and offered a timid yet sincere smile. The chemistry between her and Moses became apparent through fleeting glances full of promise and an understanding that transcended words. Soon, under Jethro's kindly gaze, the two began sharing moments that drew them closer: daily labors, whispered conversations in the shade of palm trees, and the mutual care for the animals and the household formed the backdrop for the blossoming of a sentiment as natural as it was needed. Over time, the bond between Moses and Jethro's family deepened into something more than mere hospitality. The strength, respect, and sensitivity of the new arrival endeared him to all, and especially to Zipporah, who saw in him the promise of a different future, one in which the cruel past might yield to new hope. In that atmosphere of acceptance and rebirth, love ultimately blossomed. Glances of admiration transformed into tender gestures and shared trust. Their wedding, celebrated under traditional rites and in the presence of those who witnessed the beginning of a new union, was marked by songs and dances typical of Midian. The sun shone radiantly on that day, sealing the fate of two hearts, while the tents, decorated with colorful fabrics and natural ornaments, testified to the joy and promise of a fresh start. Moses, now not only a fugitive from Egypt, but a man who had found solace among his newfound brothers and sisters, embraced his new life wholeheartedly. Alongside Zipporah, he entered a world where hope multiplied, and every shared gesture added the strength needed to face future challenges. In time, the couple blessed their union with children, completing the picture of joy and continuity for the family forged under Jethro's care. Their lively children played by the well and ran among the tents, while their parents exchanged knowing glances, recalling the arduous paths that had led them to this moment. Each child came to symbolize rebirth, a living continuation that demonstrated that even in the midst of hardship, life always found a way to renew itself. Thus, the encounter with Jethro and the marriage to Zipporah became fundamental milestones in Moses' journey, showing that even after the cruelest trials, there could come an opportunity for a new beginning. In the land where ancient dunes whispered secrets and the wind carried tales of timeless eras, the man once saved from captivity finally found a place where hope and love could freely flourish, paving the way for the grand destiny that awaited him. One morning, beneath a clear sky and in the rarefied air of Midian, Moses led his flock along the rocky trails far from the bitter memories of Egypt. Approaching a mountain with a solemn air, its summit shrouded in clouds, an unusual brilliance caught his eye. In the distance, a bush burned with intense flames but mysteriously was not consumed. Intrigued, Moses descended the slope cautiously, unaware that he was about to face a call that would change his life forever. When he reached the base of the mountain, the heat from the blazing flames was almost tangible. Moses approached the burning bush slowly and, in awe, observed that despite the crackling fire, the bush remained whole, seemingly guarding a secret. With wide eyes and a pounding heart, he paused to listen to the dual sound of crackling fire and a silence filled with expectation. Suddenly, a voice resounded throughout the valley, clear and authoritative, like the distant rumble of thunder that nevertheless brought peace. The voice called, "Moses, Moses," startling the fugitive, who replied hesitantly, "Here I am." Then the voice continued firmly, imparting responsibility for the secrets of ancestry and freedom. "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The time has come for you to heed my call." Surprised and confused, Moses fixed his gaze on the burning bush as the voice revealed the mission entrusted to him. The commander of the universe decreed that he should return to Egypt to free the Hebrews who had long endured the yoke of slavery. Each word hung in the air, infusing the landscape with an overwhelming weight and a hope that seemed to be reborn with every syllable. Confronted with such a revelation, Moses' heart pounded wildly, mixing fear with curiosity at this inescapable summons. In the heat of the moment, overcome by disbelief, Moses responded, "But Lord, how can I, a mere man, go to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of slavery?" His voice trembled as he searched for answers in the flickering flames that danced yet did not consume the bush. The divine voice answered with clarity that exceeded human understanding, "I will be with you. Thus you shall be able to lead my people out of oppression." The miraculous signs that followed confirmed the truth of the words spoken as the bush's fire persisted, enigmatic in its endurance and power. Still hesitant, Moses questioned his lack of eloquence and his crippling fear, saying, "I am not a man of words. How then can I convince Pharaoh and lead the Hebrews?" Then the voice, in tones that seemed to echo an ancient promise, declared the presence of an assistant. "Your brother Aaron shall be your mouth, aiding you in speaking all that you must." Thus the message was complete, demonstrating that the burden of the mission would not be carried alone, but shared with a companion destined to support and strengthen the proclamation of freedom. The fire consuming the bush now stood as the visible symbol of divine will, a sign that would not fade with the wind or the uncertainty of human thought. The flame burned tirelessly, illuminating Moses' face and revealing in every spark the urgency of a mission that transcended his own understanding. Each word spoken by the voice took deep root within him, recalling the sacred names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and weaving together the dark bond that linked those who lived under the yoke of injustice with those who still yearned for redemption. The land around seemed to hold its breath as Moses, his gaze fixed on the phenomenon unfolding before him, struggled against doubt and reluctance. The call was as monumental as the mountain's peaks, and his spirit hesitated to immediately accept what sounded like an inescapable destiny. However, the persistence of the divine voice and the irrefutable signs presented in the untiring blaze of the burning bush won his heart, and the man recognized that this was the path he must follow, even if it were shrouded in uncertainty and danger. Without haste but with renewed determination, Moses withdrew from the place, his face still illuminated by the unusual glow of the sacred fire, and deep within his soul, the murmur of the divine words echoed relentlessly. The mission to free his people was urgent and irrevocable. The call that had pierced the silence of that mountain not only commanded his return to Egypt, but also ushered in a new era, where man, united to the divine will, would become the herald of the Hebrews' redemption. Upon returning to the camp, his thoughts raced like the desert wind, and in every corner he replayed the encounter with the burning bush, the powerful voice, and the promise of aid through Aaron. That very night, under a sky studded with celestial light, Moses gathered with Aaron and recounted, with the sincerity of one who had experienced a transcendent event, all that had been declared in that sacred moment. Aaron, with a calm countenance and attentive eyes, absorbed every detail of his brother's account, recognizing the magnitude of the burden he would now share. Throughout that long night, as the flames of the sacred fire died down, only to rekindle the memory of the divine call, Moses' spirit gradually transformed. The reluctance that had once paralyzed him began to give way to a firm resolve. He would accept the mission, regardless of the obstacles to come, guided by the certainty that the Almighty's strength accompanied him. Thus, united by destiny and the conviction of a greater cause, Moses and Aaron prepared for what was to come, marking the beginning of a journey that would traverse the sands of Egypt and inaugurate the freedom of the Hebrew people. Every step taken from that moment bore the indelible mark of that sacred encounter. The journey back to the land where it all began was not merely a geographic crossing, but an inner journey of courage and faith. And so, under the ever-watchful gaze of eternity, and with the unified support of his brother, Moses consecrated himself to the mission of liberating the Israelites, determined to transform the history of an oppressed people, a journey that began in that very instant when a bush ablaze without being consumed became the messenger of a future filled with hope and possibility. After the decree of liberation was forcefully proclaimed by Moses and Aaron before the Egyptian throne, an atmosphere of restlessness and apprehension hung over the empire's borders. The divine design instructed Moses to confront the Pharaoh's power and with a firm hand apply punishments that would shake the very foundations of Egypt. Determined to fulfill the Almighty's mandate, Moses embarked on a journey toward the pinnacle of oppression, where the empire's heart beat proudly and at the same time arrogantly before the cries of an oppressed people. In an austere hall adorned with hieroglyphs recounting the glory of the pharaohs, Moses raised his voice in a solemn and unyielding tone. "Thus says the Lord, let my people go." Aaron, by his side, reinforced the call with commanding words that reverberated through the imposing palace corridors. Yet the sovereign, wrapped in his absolute conviction, firmly refused to yield to this demand. And it was at this very moment that the first sign of divine justice manifested. At daybreak, the waters of the Nile, the vital source that nourished the nation, transformed in a surprising and forceful manner into a liquid as red as blood. No longer did it flow with the transparency that once sustained life. Instead, it ran deep and viscous red, staining its banks and untouched beds, taking with it the vitality of the fish. What had begun as a gently sweet aroma soon suffused the air with a stench of decay and warning. The Egyptians, confused and panicked, watched in horror as a river that had long symbolized fertility was now blotted by divine punishment. Even though the phenomenon had seized the country, the Pharaoh remained stubborn, refusing to acknowledge the authority that led to redemption. Then the second sign entered the scene. An enormous swarm of frogs invaded every corner, from palace walls to the humble dwellings along the Nile. The leaping creatures with bulging eyes and sudden hops appeared at every moment, invading rooms, temples, and even the resting nooks of the nobles. The cries of those affected intermingled with ceaseless croaking as the frogs turned quiet into a clamor of natural rebellion. Unmoved by these displays, the third plague manifested itself in an equally impressive manner. In a flash of disgust and discomfort, the land witnessed a burgeoning infestation of tiny insects. These minuscule creatures, resembling lice and mosquitoes, spread at an astonishing pace, landing on the skin of Egyptians, disturbing both animals and people with their relentless buzzing. The environment that had once exuded meticulous order was overtaken by these pestilent manifestations, filling homes with an immeasurable nuisance. Persistent in his pride, the Pharaoh showed no sign of weakness before these divine onslaughts. And so it came to pass that, with an air of inevitability, the fourth plague descended upon the Egyptian dominions. A swarm of flies emerged on every corner, gathering in large clusters that disrupted peace and blurred the vision of all in their midst. The flies buzzed so loudly as to be deafening, interrupting rituals, gatherings, and even the day-to-day life of the inhabitants, adding palpable unrest to an already suffocating atmosphere of chaos. The empire's suffering did not cease. Next came the fifth manifestation, which struck terror into the vitality of the animals as a pestilence descended upon the Egyptian livestock. Death mercilessly spread rapidly. Horses, oxen, sheep, and camels, essentials to Egypt's economy and grandeur, fell in a chilling silence. Animals that had once trotted gracefully through the fields now lay immobile and lifeless, as though the very essence of their existence had been snatched away by the unseen hand of punishment. It wasn't long before the punishment turned directly on the flesh of men. The sixth plague afflicted every Egyptian with painful boils and sores that burst open on their skin. Amid moans and lamentations, the pain spread like an uncontrollable fire, leaving deep marks not only on the body but on the soul. People who had once exuded confidence writhed in agony as the plague spread indiscriminately, transforming daily life into one of despair. In that relentless sequence of divine humiliations, the stage was set for the punishment that would demonstrate the devastating power of the heavens. With unbridled force, the seventh plague burst forth in the form of a hailstorm. High above, laden clouds gathered, and suddenly the firmament surrendered to a torrential shower of ice. Each hailstone, with its furious impact, appeared to be cast with the precision of a solemn oath, shattering crops, toppling structures, and leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Streaks of lightning and booming thunder accompanied the deadly barrage, echoing across the land with the intensity of ancestral wrath. As the Egyptian people sought desperate refuge, the eighth plague took shape and materialized as an invasion of ravenous locusts. An army of grasshoppers emerged as if from the depths of the desert, sweeping away any hope of renewal. Trees, fields, and gardens that had once vibrated with life were devoured within moments by this destructive wave. The lush greenery was swallowed up by the winged horde, leaving behind a trail of devastation and misery, a clear sign that human power was irrevocably subservient to a higher will. And finally, just when it seemed that the peak of torment had been reached, the ninth plague presented itself in a surprising and terrifying manner. An impenetrable darkness enveloped Egypt, covering the sky with a total shroud of gloom. For 3 long days the sun was replaced by a black veil, and not even the brightest torches could break the darkness. Streets, palaces, and temples were plunged into an oppressive silence, where the unknown and fear spread and tormented every heart. Yet the final blow was reserved for the moment that would seal the fate of the mighty and open the doors to the long-awaited liberation. Moses gathered his people amid a murmur of urgency. With firm eyes and a voice laden with determination, he proclaimed that so the angel of death would not enter their houses, every family must mark their doorposts with the sacred sign, the blood of the Lamb. In the final hours before dawn, under a sky heavy with the imminence of divine judgment, families worked swiftly and with fervent faith. The blood, as red as the light of a sacred fire, was carefully applied to their doors, transforming each home into a place of protection, a seal of obedience to the message received. Those simple marks became a shield, visible to the messenger of death, who, upon seeing the sign, would pass by, sparing the firstborns who anxiously awaited liberation. This ritual, filled with symbolism and hope, united every inhabitant with the promise of redemption as the heavy silence mingled with the sound of hurried footsteps in the twilight. Thus, with hearts beating in unison with faith and anxiety, the Hebrews prepared for the climax of divine judgment, emphasizing that even on the verge of an appalling plague, intervention by the Almighty would bring the long-awaited salvation. In the early hours of the morning that followed the darkness, the 10th plague erupted with the sharpest edge of all punishments, the death of the firstborn. As Egypt braced itself for the silence of a new dawn, an angel, sent by the supreme command, traversed the homes and chambers. In an act that seemed predestined by fate, the lives of the firstborn, from the households of the nobles to those of shepherds and even among the animals, were abruptly cut short. Mourning spread like an uncontrollable wildfire, bringing sorrow and remorse to the hearts of those who had until then believed in the immortality of their traditions and the might of their reign. Amid tears and pain, the pressure on the Pharaoh became unbearable. The ruler, stunned by the irreparable loss and incapable of mending the damage inflicted by the unseen hand of destiny, finally yielded to the divine order, permitting the departure of the Hebrews from slavery. Moses, together with Aaron, now surveyed the scene of an empire undone by the signs of supreme justice, his eyes bearing witness to a miracle forged in the cry for freedom. Every plague, with its meticulous and impeccable execution, had played a crucial role in the narrative of liberation. From the blood that stained the Nile, to the boils that marred men's flesh, from the hail that tore the earth to the darkness that swallowed over the land of the firstborn, the sequence of events composed a symphony of terror and, at the same time, redemption. In orchestrating these events, Moses did not act merely as a messenger, but as the protagonist of an epic destined to rewrite the history of a subjugated people. As the echoes of the punishments resonated throughout the empire and the city gates began to open for the long-awaited departure, the Hebrews, imbued with renewed hope, gathered their belongings and hearts. The harsh lesson of the plagues remained etched in everyone's memory. Yet more than that, it hastened the moment of escape toward a new land, destined to be the cradle of freedom and a new era for the chosen people. And so, in the glow of dawn that followed the final plague, Moses led the Hebrews into the desert, each step carrying the weight of the events that had unfolded in the heart of Egypt. The drama of the signs, the precision of the punishments, and the magnitude of divine intervention transformed that moment into a watershed, the end of an era of oppression and the beginning of a blessed journey toward redemption. The cries of freedom and whispers of change intertwined in the air, making each stone, every gust of wind, and every last spark of the disasters a testament to the victory of supreme destiny. With hearts still pounding from the weight of the punishments and the newly born hope of liberty, the Hebrews finally bid farewell to the oppressive soil of Egypt. In the early hours of a day that was bidding farewell to darkness, Moses led his people along the roads that distanced them from the old yoke. Each step was steeped in the longing for a renewal as families, united and determined, dragged their belongings toward an uncertain destiny. Yet the unyielding voice of the Pharaoh, driven by blind pride and the pain of losing his only son, soon made itself heard. A change of heart was decreed, and an implacable army was dispatched to recapture those who dared defy the established power. The scene transformed rapidly. As the Israelites moved as a pulsating living mass in flight, the sound of military boots and drums grew louder with each step. The smoke from the Egyptian encampments billowed on the horizon, merging with the dust raised by the pursuing army's hurried march. Fear gripped every face, yet the faith, inspired by recent miracles, renewed the strength to move forward. The determination to escape the tyranny of an empire once supreme caused every heart to beat to the rhythm of an approaching freedom. The path led the people to the edge of a vast and imposing ocean, its waters known as the Red Sea. The sea presented an expanse of mystery and peril to those who had never before ventured into its depths, but it now stood as their only possible refuge from the advancing Egyptians. Amid growing anguish and the fervor of hope, Moses lifted his eyes to the horizon, where the voice of the Almighty assured them not to fear the chasm of the unknown. At that precise moment, time itself seemed to suspend. The sky, heavy with tempestuous clouds, heralded the magnificent manifestation of divine will. Amid the human turmoil, a hidden hand in the firmament was preparing a miracle. Inspired by unwavering faith, Moses raised his arms toward the sea, holding his staff, and his firm, solemn words filled the air. "Let the waters be parted, In an instant of sheer astonishment, nature responded in harmony with the divine command. The ensuing scene took one's breath away. The waters tore apart as if an invisible force had passed through every droplet, dividing the sea into two vast liquid walls. From the center emerged a dry, shimmering path, flanked by columns of water that resonated with supreme power, a highway forged by the Creator's touch for the escape of his chosen ones. The Israelites, their eyes wide with awe and spirits ignited by hope, advanced step by step along the revealed passage, while the sound of the waves boomed in the distance like an echo of divine intervention. At the same time, the pursuit had not ceased among the ranks of the Egyptians. The army, driven by despair and wounded pride, raced after the fugitives, determined to reclaim the empire's treasured subjects. Tension reached its climax as, on one side, the people of liberty trod the path into the unknown, and on the other, the Egyptian legions marched with vengeful resolve. Every step taken by the Israelites symbolized the transformation of a fate once sealed by oppression, while the marching drums of the Egyptians seemed to mark the final beat of an empire about to crumble. Then the crossing began. Men, women, and children, guided by Moses and the light radiating from the miracle, hurried reverently along the unobstructed path between the walls of water. The narrative was one of pure tension and relief combined, the fear of the imminent, the wonder of the impossible, and the conviction that divine touch guided each step on the wet sand where minutes before, the untamed sea had reigned supreme. As the people advanced, the scene off in the background took on a tragic dimension. In the very moment the last Israelite stepped safely onto the new pathway, a sealed destiny awaited the oppressors. A growing murmur spread along the banks. Obeying divine will, the waters began to recede slowly, as if closing an inexorable gate. The water pillars drew together with the precision of a celestial clock. The Egyptian army, now confronted by an inescapable abyss, felt the chill of defeat sweep over their hearts. The pursuit turned into desperate, belated panic. In a dramatic instant, the waters, which moments before had been parted to grant passage to freedom, collapsed with a deafening roar. As though the very fury of the gods had surged from the depths of the sea, the liquid walls met with a monumental crash. The roar of the collision mingled with screams and the calamities foretold. The Egyptian army was engulfed by the wrath of the waves, and the crossing was sealed with the certainty that divine intervention had never failed. The journey, once filled with uncertainty, had become the stage for an epic victory. The Hebrew people, who until then had lived under the yoke of oppression, were now witnessing a tableau of redemption and renewal. The crossing of the Red Sea was not merely the physical escape from a devastated empire, but the symbol of a liberation destined to honor generations to come. Moses, exalted as the herald of supreme justice, observed with eyes reflecting both the intensity of the miracle and the depth of the faith that kept the flame of hope alive. With the dead and the vanquished left behind, the Israelites pressed onward toward the Promised Land, a future replete with challenges, yet whose residual light shone with the promise of a rebirth for a people long oppressed. The sea, silent witness to the miracle that had transformed the destiny of the fleeing, forever guarded the memory of those moments when divine intervention manifested in the most ineffable manner. After the long journey through the desert, the people of Israel reached the imposing slopes of Mount Sinai, a peak shrouded in mystery and reverence that seemed to touch the sky. The thin air and the solemn silence of the place exuded an aura of sanctity, which instilled both awe and hope in the hearts of those gathered there. Moses, the chosen leader, ascended the rocky trails alone, guided by an unshakable faith and the supreme call that resonated within him. At the summit, surrounded by thick clouds and the murmur of ancient winds, Moses found himself before a presence that transcended human understanding. Divinity emanated from every corner of the mountainside, manifesting as an intense yet gentle light that illuminated the interior of a natural cave where the Almighty was made known. The very atmosphere pulsed with the power of word and promise. It was in that moment, amid a reverence that froze the soul, that God spoke through the silence, a majestic and serene voice echoing through the valleys and reaching Moses' attentive ears. With a solemnity blending love and justice, the Creator handed down the sacred stone tablets, engraved with the 10 Commandments, eternal laws that would govern the conduct of the chosen people. Every word, inscribed with masterful precision, carried a moral weight that transcended time, establishing not only rules of behavior, but also a profound covenant between God and Israel. The pact sealed in that moment was the ultimate symbol of hope for a future of freedom and a community destined to experience divine justice. Descending from the mount, Moses carried with him the gleaming tablets that reflected heavenly light, even amid the rough desert rocks. The people, anxious for the return of their leader, waited in the shadows of hastily pitched tents, their faces illuminated by unwavering faith. Yet the hope that had been kindled in that sacred moment did not endure for long. While waiting, an uncontrollable restlessness erupted among the Israelites. The anxiety of not seeing something tangible in their new reality led them astray from the path of trust. In an unprecedented and condemned act, the people, fearful of Moses' prolonged absence, gathered in a tumult of impulses and distrust. They fashioned before themselves an idol, skillfully molded and covered in glistening gold, the golden calf. This statue, born from the hands of men who sought security in material forms, became the center of a hasty adoration, revealing a disobedience that would afflict hearts and render them vulnerable to divine wrath. Upon descending and beholding the scene, Moses was overcome by a devastating surge of indignation. Shock rippled through his very being as he witnessed men, once inspired by miracles and promises, succumbing to the false charms of gold. In an impulsive outburst of fury and sorrow, he lifted the sacred tablets received from heaven and with a decisive blow shattered them to pieces. The sound of breaking stone echoed throughout the camp, marking the end of an era of pure covenant and the beginning of a period of deep remorse. This episode, as tragic as it was symbolic, revealed the fragility of human hearts when exposed to despair and doubt. Tears mingled with desert dust as the multitude, ashamed and repentant, withdrew before the justified anger of their leader. The breaking of the tablets was not a mere act of violence, but the rupture of an unbreakable commitment to the divine, a covenant that, though forged in celestial brilliance, could not be negated by idolatrous practices. Amid the sorrow that pervaded the camp, Moses retreated to the sacred Mount Sinai on a journey of introspection and a quest for redemption. For days, silence and solitude were his only companions, as the collective weight of the people's transgression was felt in every whisper of the wind. The anguished leader fervently interceded for those who had strayed from the Almighty's path, pleading for a new opportunity to restore the covenant that had been broken on that fateful day. And the heavens, in their infinite mercy, heard Moses' plea. In the quiet of the mountain, a new divine manifestation approached. In a gentle, serene tone, the Almighty commanded the leader to ascend once more, so that the covenant with Israel might be restored. Under the watchful gaze of the stars and the glow of the dawn, Moses, overcome by the pain of betrayal and driven by the hope of reconciliation, ascended once again. At the summit of Mount Sinai, surrounded by a peace that seemed to wash away the scars of the past, divinity delivered new tablets, immaculate stone relics engraved with the same 10 commandments that this time would guide the steps of a people now reconstituted in faith and obedience. This act, symbolizing the renewal of the sacred pact, marked the beginning of a blessed community that, despite its flaws, would choose to honor the legacy of justice and mercy. Coming down the mountain with the new tablets in hand, Moses found a silent people, their hearts heavy with remorse, awaiting the restoration of trust. This unique moment, where the divine met the human, symbolized the resilience of the covenant and the people's capacity to start anew. Thus, Mount Sinai became the place where the covenant was reaffirmed, where forgiveness intermingled with discipline, and where the 10 Commandments came to serve as the light guiding generations toward a life of righteousness and communion. And there, under the eternal gaze of the heavens and the murmur of the winds, the sacred covenant was sealed once again, not merely as a set of laws, but as a symbol of the unbreakable union between the Almighty and those who, though imperfect and chosen by a renewing faith, decided to tread the path of salvation. During the long and arduous years that the Israelites wandered the desert, the landscape was one of relentless sun, vast dunes and starry nights that seemed to guard ancestral secrets. Under the firm leadership of Moses, the people obeyed the divine decrees, even when the path was filled with uncertainties and immeasurable challenges. The Most High guided each step through inhospitable terrain toward the Promised Land, while families gathered in makeshift tents, following with faith the route that had been laid out for them. Each day the Hebrews faced trials that tested both body and spirit. Thirst knocked at their door under the scorching heat. The lack of water filled their eyes with worry, and in moments of despair, the thin air carried echoes of desperate cries for help. Just as thirst parched men's lips, hunger visited the tents, leaving children and the elderly with a palpable emptiness. In response to this agony, divine power made itself known. From high above in the desert, manna, a mysterious food as delicate as the morning dew, fell to the ground, covering the earth like small pearls that sustained life. Along with the manna, swarms of quail appeared in flocks, their wings beating the rhythm of a miracle that nourished the people and revived every exhausted heart. But it was not only the basic needs that marked the journey. Over the years, the discipline of the desert was tested by insurrections and murmurs that undermined the unity of Israel. At times, the people erupted in thunderous protests, questioning Moses' orders and showing distrust in the seemingly insurmountable ways of the desert. Amid these uprisings, the leader drew upon the strength of his conviction, organizing the tribes and reordering the ranks of the Hebrews so that each clan and every family could find its place in the emerging new society rising from the sands. It was in this context of trials that he also established the construction of the tabernacle, a sacred dwelling for the divine presence, built with finely polished wood, carefully worked cork, and exquisite fabrics, each detail reflecting the brilliance of the covenant and the promise of protection during uncertain nights. For 40 years, the desert landscape transformed into a scene of challenges and miracles. Amid sandstorms and the incessant murmur of the winds, the Israelites learned to trust in divine providence, renewing their strength with the heavenly manna and finding shelter under tents that spread out like tiny islands of hope. Every day was a battle against aridity, every night an invitation to introspection and study of the laws that governed the new covenant between God and the chosen people. And even when tempers flared in rebellion, Moses remained the mediator between wrath and forgiveness, ever ready to intercede, to teach, and to reorganize the tribes of Israel so that they would never forget the promise awaiting them beyond the horizon. Yet even amid a journey marked by miracles, fate reserved a moment of rupture that would change the course of Moses' path. In an episode marked by intense emotion and irreversible consequences, the leader, after witnessing countless trials and having raised a people who had sometimes hesitated to trust fully, found himself immersed in a critical situation that demanded an immediate response. During one of the many journeys through the arid desert, before a thirsty flock and a camp anguished by the lack of vital water, God ordered Moses to speak to a rock so that fresh water would gush forth to quench the thirst of the entire people. However, the accumulated tension resulting from years of protests, doubts, and the heavy burden of leading an entire nation caused Moses, in a moment of deep anger and impatience, not to follow the divine command exactly. Instead of calmly conveying the sacred word to the rock, the leader, overcome by emotion, raised his staff and struck the rock forcefully, causing water to flow out. Yet this action, although it temporarily alleviated the thirst of the Israelites, expressed disobedience, for it violated the specific command to act with words of faith as ordered by the Most High. The sound of the impact echoed along the barren slopes, while those present, men, women, and children, watched in astonishment at the earth's response, fully aware that this was not the behavior of a leader completely guided by the divine will. In a tense silence, the response from heaven was not long in coming. God's anger, which until then had been contained within miracles and providence, manifested itself in an implacable and inexorable manner. In his pure wisdom, the Creator decided at that moment to seal Moses' fate. The man who had so long led the Israelites out of oppression and pleaded for the miracles of manna and quail would be prevented from entering the promised land. The divine punishment decreed that, although he had fulfilled his role as liberator and mediator for decades, Moses himself would not enjoy the ultimate reward that came from the unwavering faith of his people. Thus, even as the sound of water momentarily quenched their thirst, a new chapter began to unfold, in a story replete with challenges and revelations. The 40 years in the desert came to be remembered not only as a period of miracles and renewal, but also as the time when the price of disobedience was paid at a singular cost. Moses, despite his unparalleled leadership and the countless interventions of the Most High, left an indelible lesson that the exact fulfillment of divine commands was essential to sealing the covenant and ensuring entrance into the long-awaited Promised Land. And so, as the camp prepared for the final steps toward the future, the Israelites carried with them the vivid memory of a leader who, though imperfect, had guided them on paths of faith, resilience, and divine provision, but who, in the end, was deprived of the advanced consolation of setting foot on the very soil that heaven had destined for his people. At the dawn of his final days, the horizon held a singular secret. From the top of Mount Nebo, Moses gazed into the distance at the Promised Land, a land bathed in light and promise, where the echo of divine blessings merged with the ancestral hope of a people who had crossed the desert for so many decades. Mount Nebo, the silent witness to epic journeys, now held in its embrace the setting where the trajectory of the leader who had challenged empires and led a nation toward freedom was coming to an end. Gathered among his brothers and descendants, the Israelites paused to hear Moses' final speech. His voice, though marked by the hardships of 40 years of pilgrimage, still resonated with the firm authority of a man chosen by the Most High. Before that sacred panorama, he spoke with a tone of farewell and hope, reiterating the laws that had been inscribed on the covenant's tablets. Each word he uttered reminded them of the responsibility that rested upon the people's shoulders to honor justice, mercy, and the commandments that sealed their communion with God. Moses drew everyone's attention to the importance of following the path of righteousness, emphasizing that the divine precepts were not mere rules, but the compass that would guide every journey and keep the flame of faith burning bright. He recalled with emotion the trials faced in the desert, from the provision of manna to the quail that appeared in response to earnest pleas, to the teachings of the tabernacle, erected with the sweat and determination of a people in search of their destiny. In his speech, he urged the new generation never to forget the lessons forged on the heights and in the sands of the desert, for that sacred covenant was the bond that united them with the greatness of the Creator. As a gentle wind caressed the slopes of Mount Nebo, carrying with it memories of battles won and tears shed, Moses regarded his companions with eyes reflecting gratitude, sorrow, and the certainty of a duty fulfilled. He exhorted them to preserve the memory of the miracles performed and to honor the promise that, even in his absence, the divine presence would always accompany them. Every word was a blessing, every command an invitation to let fidelity to the law permeate their daily lives. When he finished his speech, the aged leader settled quietly amidst the immensity of the landscape, where twilight announced the departure of the day. There, in the silence that followed his final declarations, Moses' destiny reached its end. At the age of 120, a time when human history intermingles with divine miracles, the leader, whose life had been marked by extraordinary deeds and sacrilegious challenges, peacefully yielded to eternal rest. The presence of God, who had guided him from the banks of the Nile to the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, now sealed his transition to the realm of eternity. The ending was as mysterious as it was sublime. In a quietness that seemed orchestrated by the Creator himself, Moses drew his last breath, gathering in that final exhalation the harmony of a life dedicated to love, justice, and liberation. The old leader was buried by God in a place that remains shrouded in secrecy, just as the roots of a history that can never be fully known. The spot of his rest, chosen for reasons known only to the Most High, became part of the veil that separates the divine from the earthly, leaving the people with the living memory of his leadership and the eternal legacy of his words. As the sun set, tinting the sky with shades of orange and purple, the Israelites contemplated the landscape. This promised land, which, though seen from afar, remained the object of future dreams and struggles. And so in the final act of this grand chapter, Moses, with his final speech and serene departure, left an indelible message. Faith and obedience to divine laws are the foundations upon which hope is built. The legacy of a life dedicated to the call of the Most High transcends time and illuminates the path for those who follow. In the intimacy of that moment of transition, the people understood that the end of an era did not mean the termination of the sacred covenant, but the beginning of a new stage in which Moses' teachings would remain forever engraved in the hearts and traditions of Israel. He became, after all, the eternal messenger between heaven and earth, the symbol of a covenant that, despite being marred by challenges and human failings, could never be broken because it was upheld by the invincible power of divine providence. And so the book of life of the Israelites closed with the name of Moses, not merely remembered as the liberator, but as the keeper of the law and the mediator of a covenant that endures, an eternal echo that will continue to inspire generations. With the vision of the promised land in the distance, and hearts filled with his teachings, the people moved forward, guided by the light of those who, though invisible, remain to lead humanity toward a tomorrow full of faith, justice, and renewal.